L'homme existe-t-il depuis seulement 25 millions d'années? Descend-il vraiment du singe? Michael Cremo, chercheur en histoire et en philosophie des sciences, membre de l'History of Science Society et de l'American Anthropological Association, auteur du livre L'histoire secrète de l'espèce humaine ainsi que de plusieurs autres ouvrages et articles, nous livre ici les failles de l'archéologie officielle, et ceci à l'aide des témoignages même des plus grands archéologues de notre temps. Il nous révèle des preuves jusqu'alors tenues au secret, démontrant ainsi l'antériorité de l'existence humaine sur Terre, tout en détruisant les hypothèses de la théorie de l'évolution. Filmée à l'Université de Concordia, cette conférence choc sera bientôt disponible en DVD, en français et en anglais.
I'd like to thank the Vedic Cultural Society for the invitation to speak to you tonight about my book, Forbidden Archeology, which gives a Vedic perspective on human origins and antiquity. So, first of all, I'd like to introduce myself as a researcher in history and philosophy of science for the Bhaktivedanta Institute. And that is the science studies branch of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. The purpose of the Institute is to study concepts of modern science in light of India's timeless Vedic wisdom. So the talk I'm going to give tonight is based on talks that I've given at the Royal Institution in London, the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, and other scientific institutions, conferences, and universities throughout the world. My research into human origins and antiquity is guided by my studies in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. And these writings tell us that human civilizations have come and gone on this planet for vast periods of cyclical time. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about this Vedic concept of cyclical time, you could consult this paper, which I presented at the World Archaeological Congress, and it was later published in a peer-reviewed conference proceedings volume. The basic unit of Vedic cyclical time is called the day of Brahma, or the Kalpa. This day of Brahma lasts for 4,320,000,000 years. It's followed by a night of Brahma, which also lasts for 4,320,000,000 years. And the days follow the nights endlessly in succession. And during the days of Brahma, life, including human life, is manifest in the universe, and during the nights, life is dormant. Now, if we carefully study the Vedic cosmological calendar, we'll see that the current day of Brahma, the one we're in right now, began about 2 billion years ago. So a Vedic archaeologist might expect to find evidence for a human presence going back almost 2 billion years. Now, the ancient Vedic writings also speak of ape men. The idea of ape men wasn't invented by European scientists of the 19th century. Long before that, the authors of these ancient Sanskrit writings were speaking of such things. But they also tell us that alongside these ape men existed human beings like us. So the basic picture that you get is one of coexistence, not evolution. And the period of coexistence goes very, very, very far back in time. Of course, these ideas are somewhat different from the ideas about human origins and antiquity that we get from Charles Darwin and his modern followers. Actually, a friend of mine from India told me recently, said, Michael, maybe you're a reincarnation of Charles Darwin. You've had to come back to correct your mistake. So I don't know if I can do it in one lifetime. It may take me a few hundred or so, but maybe you can help me out a little bit. So what do the Darwinists tell us about human origins? Well, first of all, they say that life began on Earth between 2 and 3 billion years ago. Some scientists say they can detect chemical signs of life going back about 3 billion years. But the oldest undisputed fossil evidence for life that paleontologists now have, fossils of undisputed single-celled creatures, go back about 2 billion years, which is, interestingly enough, the beginning of the day of Brahma. Then they say the first primates, the first apes and monkeys, came into existence about 40 million years ago. Then they say the first hominids, the first ape men, came into existence about 6 million years ago. And finally, they say that humans of our type, anatomically modern humans, came into existence about 100,000 years ago. At least that's the age of the oldest undisputed fossil evidence for anatomically modern humans in terms of what modern archaeologists think is true. And they say all of the physical evidence supports this evolutionary picture of human origins with human beings like us coming into existence between 100 or 150,000 years ago, something like that. But when I did 8 years of research into the entire history of archaeology, I found something quite different. I found that over the past 150 years, archaeologists have discovered huge amounts of evidence showing that humans like us have existed throughout this entire period of time, going all the way back to the very beginning of the history of life on Earth. This evidence takes the form of anatomically modern human skeletal remains, anatomically modern human footprints, and human artifacts of various kinds. I've documented this evidence in this book, Forbidden Archaeology, co-authored with my co-author, Richard Thompson. It's a 900-page book, basically aimed at the scientific world. The book is also available in a shorter, popular edition, which is also available in French. It's been published in French in Europe by the publisher Rocher, so you could get it on, if you like French, if you prefer French as your primary language. It's available on the French, Amazon.com. Now, this evidence for extreme human antiquity, which contradicts the current theories, is not very well known, both within the scientific world and to the public at large, because of what I call a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. We can call this blue box here the knowledge filter, and it represents the current consensus on human origins. And reports of evidence that conform to this consensus will pass through this social and intellectual filter very easily, which means students will read about this evidence in their textbooks. People will hear scientists speaking about it on television. If they go to the local museum of natural history, they'll see the artifacts and bones on display. But if we have reports that radically contradict this current consensus, they tend to be filtered out of the discussion, which means we don't read about this evidence in our textbooks, we don't hear scientists speaking very much about it, and if we go to the museum, we won't see the artifacts or bones on display, although they may be there somewhere in the museum collection. And I'm not talking here about some satanic conspiracy theory. It's a very well-known, established fact among historians, philosophers, and sociologists of science that theory determines how evidence is treated. And what I've simply done is demonstrate how that process operates in archaeology and human origin studies generally. So what I'd like to do now is give a few representative examples of the kinds of evidence that I'm talking about. I want to show two things. First of all, that this evidence actually does exist, and I also want to say something about how the knowledge filtering process operates in each case. So I'm going to start with evidence that's relatively close to what many scientists are now prepared to accept in terms of human antiquity, and then gradually we'll go back further and further and further in time. And some of these, as I said, this knowledge filtering process has been going on for a long time. So some of the cases I'm going to talk about are from the more recent history of archaeology. Some of the cases will be from the earlier history of archaeology. This is Virginia Steen McIntyre. She's an American geologist who I know personally. When she was a young woman, just beginning her career in archaeology, she was involved in dating an archaeological site in Mexico called Huayatlaco, which is near the town of Puebla in central Mexico. There, some American archaeologists discovered these artifacts and others like them. And they may look primitive to us, but according to archaeologists, artifacts of this type are made only by anatomically modern humans, not by any kind of ape man. The excavation was conducted by archaeologist Cynthia Irwin Williams. She conducted a very professional excavation up to all the modern standards. The artifacts were photographed in place when they were discovered, such as this one here. And here is a close-up of it, solidly embedded in the rock, indicating it was an original part of those deposits. Now, of course, the archaeologists want to know how old these implements were. So they called in a team of geologists to date the site, and in that team was Virginia Steen McIntyre. So she and her colleagues used 4 different methods to date the site. In the same layer as the artifacts, animal bones with butchering marks were found. That's another indication of a human presence. So they used the uranium series method to date those bones, and they used 2 different uranium series methods, and the protactinium method gave an age of greater than 100,000 years. The thorium age was 245,000 years. Directly above the layer in which the animal bones and the human artifacts were found was a layer of volcanic ash. So the geologists used the zircon fission track method to date that layer of ash, and they got an age of 270,000 years, which means the animal bones and human artifacts below that layer had to be at least that old. They also used a method called tetrahydration. This is based on the fact that volcanic crystals over time gradually absorb water molecules, and the water molecules begin to fill up little vesicles or air bubbles in the crystals. And by measuring the amount of water that accumulates in the crystals, you can get some idea of the age of the ash. And the age they got using that method was consistent with the methods they got using the zircon fission track method and the uranium series method. And finally, they used standard stratigraphic evidence. The artifact layers were at about 10 meters deep in terms of the landscape there, and they could determine by studying the geology of the region that the site had originally been covered by another 50 meters of sediment. So they calculated how long, studying the hydrogeology of the area, how long it would have taken to erode, those 50 meters down to the present level. And again, that age was consistent with the ages obtained by the other methods. So, the geologist, Virginia Steen McIntyre, and her colleagues concluded that the age of the site was at least 250,000 years, and they considered that a very conservative estimate. The archaeologists absolutely refused to accept this date. They said, that's impossible. Human beings capable of making these artifacts did not exist anywhere in the world 250,000 years ago because they hadn't evolved yet. And what to speak of being present in North America, because the current consensus is that you have no human beings entering North America until 20,000 years ago maximum. And most, the current consensus is actually around 15,000 years. So they absolutely refused to publish the date for the site given by their own team of geologists that they themselves called in to date the site. Now, when Virginia Steen McIntyre and some of her colleagues independently published the date for the site, she found herself in big trouble. A rumor campaign was started. People were calling her a maverick, a publicity seeker, a troublemaker. She lost a teaching position that she held at a university in the United States because of this publication. And she also suddenly found that all of her opportunities for advancement in the United States Geological Survey were suddenly blocked off. So those are some of the pressures that can be applied to scientists who have the temerity to challenge, this current consensus. But what happened is that Virginia Steen McIntyre, she was so disgusted by the treatment she was given that she and her husband moved out to a little town in the Rocky Mountains in America, and she just remained silent for 10 years until I found out about her case and wrote about it in Forbidden Archaeology and started getting her work some of the attention I think it deserves. And partly because of that, some new research is now going on down at that Huayatlaco site. And the results that are coming in are tending to confirm the original date that Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues got. For example, one of the world's leading experts on diatoms has gone down there and looked at the site. So diatoms are tiny little plants that, they're almost microscopic, but they leave little hard skeletons when they die. And there are hundreds of kinds of diatoms, each of them characteristic of a particular period in the Earth's geological history. So Van Landingham found that the type of diatoms found in the artifact-bearing layers at Huayatlaco are the type that lived in that period, 250,000 years ago. In the 1990s, a German archaeologist named Thieme found some very nicely made wooden spears at a site called Schöningen in Germany. His report was published in Nature. The interesting thing about these spears is they were shaped, they're about 6 feet long. They were shaped exactly like modern javelins, that they use in the Olympics, with a balance point about 1/3, from the tip. They were obviously a weapon made for throwing and hunting. Now, they were found in soft coal deposits 320,000 years old. So Thieme and his colleagues had to think, well, who made these? Who made these artifacts? They decided it could not have been human beings like us because human beings like us did not exist 320,000 years ago. So they thought it must have been some variety of Homo erectus living in Europe 300,000 years ago who made these artifacts. Now that was a little bit unusual because up to this point, archaeologists generally believe that the making and using of throwing weapons like this was something that only anatomically modern humans did. They'd never attributed this kind of behavior to Homo erectus. And as a matter of fact, the oldest throwing spears that they had up to this point were less than 100,000 years old, which meant they fit in with their ideas about the origin of anatomically modern humans. So So they thought, well, human beings like us didn't exist. Homo erectus must have made them. But I believe there's another solution to this problem. And it lies in northern France, where Jacques Boucher de Perthes, one of the famous early archaeologists, made an interesting discovery. At a site called Abbeville in northeastern France, he discovered this anatomically modern human jaw. He discovered it in this layer of his excavation, along with many artifacts of the human type, stone tools and weapons. Now, according to modern geologists, this layer at the Moulin-Quignon site at Abbeville is 320,000 years old. Now, even at the time that this bone, this human jawbone, was discovered in the mid-19th century, it was very controversial. Many scientists could not believe that humans existed in such a distant time in the past. So what they said was, to explain the discovery, they said, well, obviously it was some sort of hoax. Some workmen had gone to some cemetery somewhere, maybe a Roman cemetery in the region, and uncovered some human jaw and had planted it in the excavation for Boucher de Perthes to find. And actually that's the story that you see in every textbook today. Now what you don't see in the textbooks is that Boucher de Perthes was very upset by these accusations, so he went out and he performed 12 additional excavations at this site under conditions that completely ruled out any type of hoaxing or planting of artifacts. The excavations that he conducted were witnessed by professional geologists, other scientists, other responsible people, and in those additional excavations, he found in the same layers 100 additional anatomically modern human bones and teeth. But you won't read about that in the textbooks. So what I would propose is that those new discoveries confirm the original discovery of the anatomically modern human jaw. And what we have here is evidence for an anatomically modern human population that existed in northern Europe over 300,000 years ago. And I would propose it was members of that population who made the spears, the exquisitely made throwing spears that were found by Thema in northern Germany in the 1990s. I presented a paper on this topic at a major international conference on history of science. It was published in a peer-reviewed conference proceedings volume. If you like to have a look at it, I welcome you to do that. And again in the 1990s, some Australian archaeologists made some interesting discoveries of human artifacts on Flores Island in Indonesia. Their report was published in Nature. Here's an illustration of some of the artifacts found there. The artifacts were found in this layer of their excavation, which they dated using the zircon fission track method. They got an age of about 800,000 years. And again, they had to decide, well, who made these artifacts? They decided it couldn't have been human beings like us because, of course, as everyone knows, human beings like us did not exist 800,000 years ago. So, who made the artifacts? Again, they decided must have been Homo erectus, because that's who lived during that time. Nobody else was around. Who else could have done it? But there was a problem with that. Now, this map shows the area as it existed 800,000 years ago. You can see the coast of Australia comes out further. It was a time of lowered sea levels. But even during that time, we can see that Flores Island is separated from the nearest land masses by wide expanses of ocean. So the question was, well, how did Homo erectus get to Flores Island? So the archaeologist suggested, well, he made a boat and sailed there, or paddled there on a raft, which was really quite an extraordinary proposal, because up to the time of this discovery, archaeologists and anthropologists considered, deliberate ocean crossing something only that humans of our type did. And actually, the oldest evidence they had for it was evidence for sea crossing of anatomically modern humans to Australia about 50,000 years ago. And also, they had some evidence in Europe, for deliberate sea crossings to the islands in the Mediterranean around 25,000 years ago. So to be proposing that Homo erectus was doing this, 800,000 years ago was really going outside the box. But I believe there's another solution, to this little dilemma. And the solution lies here in Java. It was in Java that the very first fossils of Homo erectus were discovered back in the 1890s by the Dutch researcher Dubois. He found this quite primitive skull cap with these very pronounced eyebrow ridges, and he also found a year later in the same excavation, but about 15 meters away, this thigh bone, which he considered to be a little bit primitive, and he put the two together, the skull bone and the thigh bone, and said, well, here we have the Java ape man, Pithecanthropus erectus, which is now known under the genus name Homo erectus. And that's a story you'll see in every textbook. What you don't see in the textbooks is that later in the 1970s, two prominent British physical anthropologists very carefully studied this thigh bone, this femur. And they found it was identical in every respect to an anatomically modern human femur in all of its measurements and characteristics. They also found that this thigh bone was different than any other Homo erectus thigh bone that was found after this first one, and many have been found in Africa and China. So their report, if you'd like to have a look at it, is here. But I think it's very interesting that the thigh bone is considered to be exactly like that of a modern human being. Because according to Dubois, this is his original map of the stratigraphy at the site, the skull and the thigh bone were found in the exact same layer. And according to modern geologists who have used the potassium-argon method to date this site, this layer where both the bones were found is 800,000 years old, roughly. So what I think we have here is evidence that two types of hominids were existing in Java about 800,000 years ago. First, there was the population of Homo erectus, as represented by the Homo erectus skull, and there was also a population of anatomically modern humans coexisting along with them, as represented by the anatomically modern human femur found in the same layer. And I would propose it was members of this anatomically modern human population that made the sea crossing to Flores Island and left the stone tools there. So, the message is that to explain this type of evidence, we don't necessarily have to try to dress up Homo erectus, raise Homo erectus to the human cultural level. There's another explanation. There's actual physical evidence that anatomically modern humans were existing 300,000 years ago in Europe, 800,000 years ago in Indonesia. In 1979, Mary Leakey and her co-workers found dozens of footprints at a place called Laetoli in the country of Tanzania in East Africa. And according to Mary Leakey, these footprints were indistinguishable from anatomically modern human footprints. That's what she said in her original report, which was published in National Geographic. And now the problem was, I should say, first of all, that other physical anthropologists and archaeologists have confirmed her original judgment. Paleontologist Tim White, make no mistake about it, they are like modern human footprints. Russell Tuttle, the Laetoli footprints are indistinguishable from modern human footprints. Now the problem is, these footprints are found in layers of solidified volcanic ash 3.7 million years old. Now Mary Leakey, of course, did not believe that there were humans like us living in East Africa almost 4 million years ago. So how did she explain the footprints? Well, she said there must have been some type of hominid who had feet exactly like modern human feet, and that's how the footprints were made. It's an interesting proposal. It's possible, of course. Unfortunately, at the present moment, there is no physical evidence to support that idea. We have the skeletons of the hominids that existed at that time. There are varieties of Australopithecus, and none of them have feet exactly like modern human feet. Generally, they have toes that are somewhat longer than modern human toes. They have a first toe that can extend out to the side like a human thumb, and their feet have other ape-like features. So maybe someday in the future, someone may discover some variety of hominid that had feet exactly like modern human feet, but at the present moment, the only creature known to science by physical evidence that has a foot exactly like a modern human being is a modern human being. So, what did Mary Leakey actually find? I believe she found evidence that humans like us were present in East Africa about 4 million years ago. Now, somebody might say, well, footprints are one thing, but wouldn't it be better if you had human skeletons, of that age? And such things do exist. In the 19th, this is an anatomically modern human skull found by the Italian geologist Giuseppe Ragazzoni at a place called Castanello in northern Italy. It was part of an almost complete anatomically modern human skeleton, and he found the bones of 3 other individuals in the same place. A couple of years ago, I went to Italy to try to relocate the site where he made these discoveries. I went with an Italian friend to Castanello, and in the neighborhood we met this elderly gentleman who knew something about the location of the site. He had in his possession a very detailed 19th century geological report which gave critical information that did allow us to relocate the place where this discovery was made. So Ragazzoni had found these human skeletons in an excavation that he made. The skeletons were found in Pliocene deposits about 4 million years old, and of course they were anatomically modern. Now, when many scientists today hear about a discovery of an anatomically modern human skeleton in some impossibly old layer of rock, they say, look, there's no mystery about this whatsoever. It's very easy to explain. Only a few thousand years ago, somebody died up here at this level. His friends dug a grave, and they put the body down here, covered it over, and that's why, you think you found some anatomically modern human skeletal remains in some Pliocene formation in Italy. Now, such things can happen. They do happen. Technically, this is called intrusive burial. But Giuseppe Ragazzoni himself, the original discoverer, was a professional geologist, and he was very, very well aware of this problem. And actually, if you go back to his original reports, you'll see he considered it very carefully. He said, if it had been a burial, then the overlying layers of rock would have been disturbed, as we see here. And he said he looked very carefully when he was extracting the skeleton from the ground. And he said all the overlying layers of rock were perfectly intact. And actually, he said that each layer had its own microstratification. In other words, each of these layers was made of hundreds of other small paper-thin layers of deposits. And all of those were undisturbed. So the indication is that the skeletons really did belong in the layers in which they were found, in this case about 4 million years old, which is roughly the same age as the anatomically modern human Laetoli footprints. So I could give you many, many more cases of discoveries of anatomically modern human bones and footprints and artifacts going back 5 million years, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, but that would take too long. So we're going to fast forward a little bit. This is Carlos Ribeiro. He was, in the late part of the 19th century, the chief government geologist of Portugal, and he found hundreds of human artifacts in his country of Portugal. He found them in lower Miocene deposits about 20 million years old. Now, when he was living, he displayed the artifacts in these cases here in the Museum of Geology in Lisbon with labels indicating a lower Miocene age of 20 million years. But, if you go to the museum today, you're not going to see those artifacts there anymore. They're kept locked in these cabinets down here. Now, a couple of years ago, I was researching a paper on Ribeiro's discoveries that I later presented at a meeting of the European Association of Archaeologists. When I was doing the research, I went to Lisbon, and I went to the museum, and I got permission from the director to open up these cabinets here and to study and photograph some of these 20 million year old artifacts from Portugal. Here are some close-ups of some of them. It's an assistant of mine taking photographs in the museum. And by studying some of the old maps and field notes and documents left by Ribeiro in the museum, we were able to go out into this countryside of Portugal and relocate some of the original sites, which was not an easy task. But we did find some of them, such as the quarry at Morganera, where Ribeiro made some of his discoveries. This is one of the artifacts he discovered there with his original label on it. But, it's interesting what happened. As I said, when he was alive, he displayed the artifacts in the museum with labels indicating an age of 20 million years. After he died, his colleagues in the museum did something very interesting. They left the artifacts on display, but they wrote new labels for each of them. They thought, 20 million years ago, that's impossible. Human beings couldn't have existed 20 million years ago. So they thought, well, let's just write some new labels. So this is the new label they wrote for the artifact I just showed you. This line gives the age. It says Paleolitico Superior, Upper Paleolithic. Now, according to archaeologists today, the Upper Paleolithic period in Europe goes back about 20,000 years. So they thought 20 million years, that's impossible. 20,000 years sounds about right for artifacts like these. So they wrote new labels for everything. And then the next generation of officials in the museum simply put, the entire collection away. And I think I'm the first researcher to see these artifacts in about 50 years. Similar case from Belgium, the Belgian geologist Routot. He discovered hundreds of human artifacts in his country of Belgium, and by studying some of his old maps and field notes and records, which are kept in the Royal Museum of Natural Sciences in Brussels, I was able to relocate some of the places where he made these discoveries. For example, this is the quarry at Boncel, which is near Liège in Belgium. He discovered hundreds of human artifacts in deeply embedded, solidly embedded in these bottom layers of the quarry. And according to modern geologists, those layers belong to the Oligocene period and are about 30 million years old. Now, a Vedic archaeologist would not have any problem thinking that human beings were existing 30 million years ago on this planet. As a matter of fact, a Vedic archaeologist might be prepared to find evidence for a human presence going much further back than that, all the way back to the beginning of the day of Brahma. But for most archaeologists and anthropologists today, this is completely impossible. For a paper that I later presented at a major international conference on the history of archaeology, I was able to get access to the collection, and we were able to photograph and study some of the artifacts. Here are some photographs of the next two drawings that Routot made in his original reports early in the 20th century. If you go to the museum today, you won't see these artifacts. They're not displayed to the public. If you'd gone to the museum perhaps in the year 1910, you would have seen these artifacts displayed in the main exhibition hall of the museum with labels indicating an age of 30 million years. But after Routot died, his colleagues in the museum thought, we can't have this. No, everybody knows human beings couldn't have existed 30 million years ago. So they put the collection away, and also they destroyed a lot of the original documentation that went along with this collection, but it still is there. It would be very difficult for you to see them, but I have seen them myself. Now here's a case I found really fascinating. This is the case of the California gold mine discoveries. In the middle of the 19th century, gold was discovered in California, and miners came from all around the world to get the gold. They came to places like Table Mountain in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and to get the gold, the miners dug tunnels through solid rock. And deep inside these tunnels, the miners found human skeletons and human artifacts, hundreds of them, not just in one place, but in many dozens of places in the gold mining region. For example, they found many of these stone mortars and pestles. This particular set was found 1,500 feet from the mouth of the tunnel. 1,500 feet in a tunnel, deep in a tunnel, drilled into solid rock. That stone mortar and pestle were found by a miner, but some of the discoveries were made by professional scientists, such as Clarence King of the United States Geological Survey. Now, what makes these discoveries so interesting is they were found in solid rock belonging to the early part of the geological period called the Eocene, which means these objects would be about 50 million years old. Now, as I said, a Vedic archaeologist wouldn't have any problem with that, but for most archaeologists today, it would be completely out of the question. 50 million years ago is before the time of the first apes and monkeys, according to their, perhaps mistaken, picture of the history of life on Earth. Where do we get this date of 50 million years? A little technical information. This is the bedrock here, and these depressions are river channels that were carved into the rock by rivers that ran during the early Eocene. That's been determined by the Eocene nature of the plant and animal fossils that are found in the old river gravels, which are now compacted into solid rock. That age has also been confirmed by some other methods. Over the old river deposits are deposits of volcanic ash, huge deposits of volcanic ash that are now solidified to rock-hard consistency. These have been dated using the potassium argon method, and the ages range from 20 to 33 million years, covering the older river channel deposits. And then on top, you've got lava flows, basalt, over 200 feet thick, dated at 9 million years using the potassium argon method. And these deposits used to extend across the whole area, but then later new rivers formed and they carved out new channels, leaving Table Mountain here. And the human bones and artifacts were found in these old Eocene river deposits. These discoveries were reported to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the chief government geologist of California. His report was published by Harvard University in the year 1880. But we don't hear very much about these discoveries today due to this process of knowledge filtration that I mentioned in the beginning. And this is the scientist most responsible for the knowledge filtering in this particular case. This is Dr. William B. Holmes. He was a physical anthropologist working at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And he said, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he wouldn't have announced those conclusions that he did in that report. In other words, if the facts did not go along with the theory, then the facts had to be put aside and the person who reported them had to be discredited, and that's exactly what happened. A couple of years ago, I had my own personal experience of the knowledge filtering process in connection with these California gold mine discoveries. I was a consultant for an NBC television special called The Mysterious Origins of Man. The host of the show was the famous American actor Charlton Heston. And I appeared on that show, as did my co-author Richard Thompson. And the show was largely based on material from our book, Forbidden Archeology, although the show did include the research of others as well. When they were filming this program, I told the producers they should go to the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley, because I knew that some of the 50-million-year-old artifacts from the California gold mines are still being kept in that museum today. So when the producers went there, the museum officials told them, well, you're making a television program, you probably have a very tight deadline. We just wouldn't have time to have our workers search through our collections and bring these artifacts out for you. So then the producer said, well, no, we've got 6 months to do the program. Could you please have a look? And then the museum official said, well, we have another problem. We have a very tight budget. We just would not be able to afford to pay our staff the overtime that would be necessary for them to do this work. So then the producer said, well, money's not a problem either. We'll pay the overtime salaries for the workers. We'll pay for all the expenses. And then finally the museum official just said, no, go away. You're not going to see these things. So nevertheless, we were able to use photographs of these artifacts that were taken by Whitney in the 19th century, and the show did go on. But when Darwinist scientists in America found out that NBC was going to show an anti-Darwin program at prime time on Sunday evening when lots of innocent children would still be up, they went ballistic. They tried to stop NBC from showing the program. They weren't successful. And as a matter of fact, the program was so popular that NBC decided to show it again, which totally infuriated these people. So again, they tried to stop NBC. This time they started an internet letter writing campaign. Scientists from all over the world were invited to write letters to the chairman of the General Electric Company, which owns the NBC television network, asking him to instruct NBC not to show that program again, because, in their words, it would have destroyed everything they were trying to accomplish in the education system, where they have a complete monopoly. So it really infuriated them that, children in school would hear one thing and then go back and on television see something else. That made them mad. The pressure campaign didn't work. NBC did show the program again, and as a matter of fact, made publicity telling the American people, watch the program. These scientists don't want you to see. So that made them even more angry. I mean, especially since they knew I had something to do with this whole thing. So then they went to the American government. They went to the Federal Communications Commission, which is the agency of the United States government that controls the television broadcasting and radio industries. And this is one of their letters. And this wasn't just some individual letter that was sent. This was a letter that was widely circulated on scientific discussion groups on the internet, and scientists all over the world were invited to send supporting letters to the FCC. What they wanted the government to do was to investigate NBC, and they wanted the government to force NBC to broadcast primetime apologies to the American people, saying, we're very sorry, American people, we really didn't know what we were doing. We didn't mean to criticize Darwin and his theory. And they also wanted the government to fine NBC millions of dollars so they would never do anything like this again. Now, I'm happy to say the government didn't do that, but it was very interesting that these attempts were made. And I'm not just making this up. If you want to see all the documentation, all the internet correspondence, all the documents, they're in my book, Forbidden Archaeology's Impact. Now, last year, I went back to the museum. I was researching a paper that I later presented at the World Archaeological Congress, which is the world's largest international organization of archaeologists. And actually, I was co-organizer of a session on history of archaeology for that Congress. And perhaps because of my connection with the World Archaeological Congress, the museum officials decided, well, maybe it wouldn't be such a good idea to deny me access to these artifacts, because, as they suspected, I probably would have made an intellectual freedom case out of it through the World Archaeological Congress. Because denying researchers access to archaeological materials in public institutions is not a very nice thing to do. So they did grant me permission to study and photograph the artifacts. As I said, they're not displayed to the public. They're kept in an off-campus storage facility about 5 miles from the actual museum itself. But these are some of the 50-million-year-old artifacts from the California gold mines. Now, again, by making use of some of the old maps, field notes, and other documents left by Whitney in the museum, we were able to go out and relocate some of the places where these discoveries were originally made. This is how Table Mountain looks today. Here especially, you can see that lava cap on which covers the deposits. So we did make a little expedition to go out there, and we actually were able to relocate with some difficulty some of the old 19th century gold mining tunnels where these discoveries were originally made, and we do have some plans to do some further research in those areas. Now, how far back in time can we go with evidence like this? In the year 1862, a scientific journal called The Geologist published an interesting report. A fairly complete, anatomically modern human skeleton was found 30 meters below the surface of the ground in Macoupin County, Illinois. And according to the report, directly above the skeleton was a thick layer of slate rock that extended for dozens of meters in all directions. That's important because one of the typical sorts of objections that's made in a case like this is, well, the skeleton slipped down through a fissure from some higher level. The presence of this unbroken layer of thick slate rock, which extends for dozens of meters in all directions, tends to rule out an explanation like that. According to geologists of the state of Illinois, this layer here, below the slate layer at this particular location, is about 300 million years old. Now, for a Vedic archaeologist, that's not surprising. According to the Vedic cosmological calendar, that would have been during the time of the Chakshusha Manvantara period, one of the time cycles that's known in Vedic history. And we know from Vedic writings that humans were present on Earth during that period of time. So it's not too surprising for a Vedic archaeologist to find that there's physical evidence for it. This interesting report from Scientific American tells of a beautiful metallic vase that was found 5 meters deep in solid rock near Dorchester, near Boston. According to the United States Geological Survey, the rock in that place is 600 million years old. The oldest objects I found in my research come from South Africa. They are round metallic objects. They were found by miners at a place called Ottosdalen in the western Transvaal region. The objects are small. They're 1 or 2 centimeters in diameter. They're made of a naturally occurring type of iron called hematite, which is considered a semi-precious stone for some purposes. The most interesting feature is the parallel grooves that go around the center of each of these objects. We showed these on the NBC television special, but before NBC agreed to allow them to be filmed, they said we had to submit them to an independent company of metallurgists for analysis. The metallurgists concluded that they could see there was no way these objects could have formed naturally in the layers of the Earth. In other words, they had to have been manufactured by someone with human-like intelligence. But these objects are found solidly embedded in layers of rock 2 billion years old. So I could keep you here from now until Christmas, going through one case after another, because there are hundreds of these in the scientific literature, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be a little merciful. And I'm going to stop this little review right here. But I just want you to remember one thing that I said in the beginning. There are many scientists who will say that all the physical evidence supports this evolutionary picture of humans, with humans like us coming into existence about 100,000 years ago. I don't think it's true that all the physical evidence supports that particular idea. Actually, when we look at all of the evidence that archaeologists have discovered, and not just the small portion that we see in the current textbooks, we see there's a continuous chain of discoveries of human skeletal remains, human footprints, and human artifacts going all the way from 100,000 years ago all the way back to about 2 billion years ago, right back to the very beginning of the history of life on Earth. Now that's kind of interesting. It's an interesting coincidence, if you want to call it that, because that's exactly what we should expect to find if what the ancient Sanskrit writings tell us about human origins is true. Thank you. If you'd like to learn a little more about my work, where I'll be speaking, things of that sort, you can visit this website. You can also leave mail for me there. It comes to me. I definitely read it. I definitely answer it. So if you don't have time to get a question to me this evening and you want to put a question, then you can leave mail at that website. Does anyone have a question now? We can take a few questions and then, for a few minutes, and then afterwards I'll stick around a little while. There are some copies of my books here. If anybody wants one or wants to have it signed, I can stick around for a little while. And I think afterwards, I think the club members may have some announcements too that they'd like to make, so stay around for those. Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to know what would be the reason for the scientific community to hide all these proofs? What would be the main reason?
So the question is, why would scientists want to hide this evidence? So the way this knowledge filtering process works is a little bit subtle. It's not that they think, well, here is some true evidence, which, if known, would cause people to disbelieve in us and our theories, and therefore we're going to hide it. Rather, they think something must be wrong with this evidence. I'll give you an example. When I spoke at the Russian Academy of Sciences, one of the archaeologists there said, she was highly offended. She was very offended. How can you say, that we're doing this and we're honest people? And then she said, my book's available in the Russian language. And then she said to me, I have your book. I haven't read it, but I'm sure everything you say in it must be some kind of mistake or hoax or something.